Answer is B. Now, you have I, and I. That's I to the third. Of course, you're going to have 6. I to the third is equal to what? Negative I. So negative I times 6 is negative 6I. Answer is D, and here's why. I squared and another I squared gives me I to the fourth. I to the fourth is 1. So you're just left with negative I. It'll be D. Answer is B. Here's I to the fourth right there. And then this and this will give me a negative 1. Negative 1 times negative I should be a positive I unless I've gone through and missed something here. This is I to the fourth. That's a 1, so it's gone. This would be simply negative I to the third. A negative I to the third would give me a positive I. The answer should have been A on that. And I'll give you credit for it. I don't know why I chose B, but it should be A. Alright, the answer on this one, if you multiply here, you get a positive I squared, which is a negative 1. And here, this is a negative I squared, which is a positive 1. Negative 1 times 1 is negative 1. Pick a number from 1 to 20. The winning numbers today are 1, 3, 7, 10, 13. Homework check. This will be from the work yesterday. 3 out of 8 is going to be a percent of 38. Objective is to simplify complex expressions. Here are some flashcards first. When you think you know the answer, just say it out loud. Is what? What is it? Negative. Close. Square root of negative 1. Negative I. Negative 1. 1. Positive I. 1. I. Which is a 1, because it'd be a negative 1. 1. Negative I. Here's example 1. I minus 1 over I. We want to get that denominator of I to an even exponent. So we're going to multiply the top and the bottom by I. When I multiply the top by I, it's I times I, which is I squared. Keep the sign. And then I times 1 is just I. On the bottom, I times I is I squared. Simplify where you can. I squared is negative 1. And then you have minus I. On the bottom, I squared is negative 1. Now simplify. Get rid of this negative 1 by changing the sign of everything on top. That's when you divide by a negative 1. So it should be 1 plus I. And always make sure your answer is in the form A plus BI. And this one is. We divided this by negative 1 to get 1. And this by negative 1 to get plus I. Example 2. You want to get an even power of I on the bottom, so multiply the top and the bottom by I. On the top, I times 2I squared is going to be 2I to the third. And then when you multiply I times I, keeping the sign in the middle, you get I squared. On the bottom, I times I is I squared. Now if we go through and simplify, I to the third is a negative I. So if this is a negative I, that gives me a negative 2I in that spot. And then I squared is negative 1. If I squared is negative 1 and I have a minus sign in front of it, it becomes a double negative. So it really becomes plus 1. And then on the bottom, I squared is negative 1. Now simplify by dividing everything by negative 1, which means you change the sign. So it should be 2I minus 1. But we have to put our final answer in the form A plus BI. So we switch them around. The minus 1 goes first, and then we put plus 2I. Try this one and bring it up. On the practice problem, multiply the top and the bottom by I to get 3I to the third minus I squared over I squared. That simplifies to negative 3I plus 1 over negative 1. Change the signs on the top and then rewrite it to be in the right form. Negative 1 plus 3I is the answer. Try this bonus if you're finished with the practice. On the bonus, this is negative 1, this is negative 1, and these two together are negative 1. So 3 negatives means it's going to be a negative 1. Try this bonus if you're finished with the practice. These two will give us a positive 1. These two will give us I to the sixth, which is a negative 1. Try this bonus. These two will give me a 1 because it's I to the 8th, and these two are I to the 4th. That's a 1, so you're just left with I. Try this one. On this problem, multiply the top and the bottom by I and come up with 4I to the 4th minus 2I to the 3rd over I squared. And then we go to here, and that's a 1, so we're just left with 4. And this I to the 3rd is a negative I. Up against that minus 2 makes it plus 2I. On the bottom it's negative 1. Change the sign of everything on top, and it's in the right form, so that's it. Try this one if you're done with the practice. On the bonus, you have I to the 4th there and another I to the 4th. It just comes down to being 1. Here's another bonus. Here is an I to the 4th, but it's negative, so that's a negative 1. That's a negative I to the 4th, so that's a negative 1. They cancel out to positive, and you're left with an I. Alright, the answer should be A because we have I squared, that's I to the 4th, which is a 1, and you're left with I. So you end up with I to the 4th, and these two here make I to the 4th. That's an I to the 3rd, so it's negative I. D. So we have an I to the 4th here and another one, whoops, right there, so you're just left with I. Answer is D. 5 and 3 give me 8. That's a 1. And there's another 5 and 3, which is 8. I to the 7th is a negative I, so that's B. Example 3. I plus 1 over I minus 1. Now this is a new thing that we're doing, and you have to review something first before you can do this. And we're going to do it on a block. In this problem, you're going to have to multiply the top and the bottom by that expression on the bottom, except you change the sign. So instead of multiplying by I minus 1, you multiply the top and the bottom by I plus 1. And on the bottom, you come out with I squared minus 1, because we squared this and we squared this and put a minus sign in between the two. Now on the top, you have to really go back to Algebra 1 and multiply this out the way it's supposed to. To multiply it out, you start with this I, and you multiply that I by each of those items over there. So you would have I squared plus I. That comes from multiplying I by I, and then I by 1. And once you're finished with that I, you go to the 1 and multiply it by each of those items over there. So that's why we would get a plus I and then plus 1. That came from 1 times I and then 1 times 1. And that's supposed to be a 1 on the end, but it looks like an I. I don't know why that is, but that's a 1. Now, once you get to this point, you have to simplify. You have an I squared here and here, and you have 2 I's. You can add those together. So on the top, we have I squared, that's a negative 1. We have I plus I, that's 2I. And then we have that plus 1 on the end. On the bottom, we have an I squared, which is negative 1, and we're subtracting 1 from it. Go back to the top and notice that you have negative 1 plus 1. They just cancel out. That's a 0. So you're left with 2I on the top and a negative 2 on the bottom. Divide by that negative 2, and they just cancel out to negative 1, which leaves me with that negative I. This is a practice problem. Multiply I plus 3 times I plus 5. On this practice problem, I times I is I squared, and I times 5 is 5I. 3 times I is 3I, and 3 times 5 is 15. But you can simplify. I squared is a negative 1, and then you have 5 plus 3I, which is 8I. And then you'll have plus 15. So here, negative 1 plus 15 is 14, and then plus 8I. That's your final answer. Here's another practice. On the practice problem, multiply I by I to get I squared, and then I by a minus 3 to get minus 3I. Minus 2 times I is minus 2I, and minus 2 times minus 3 is plus 6. This is a negative 1. Add these together to get minus 5I, and keep the plus 6. Minus 1 plus 6 is positive 5. 5 minus 5I is the answer. This is a bonus problem. For the bonus, that's 9, 14, 18, and 20. I to the 20th. 20 is a multiple of 4, so the answer would be 1. Here's the bonus problem. On the bonus, you have a 1 there, and then you have an I to the 5th. Remember, I to the 5th is the same as this, so that's a 1. Your answer would be I. This is practice on multiplying. If I had I plus 3 and times I minus 1, you would multiply I, this first one, by each of these and come up with I squared minus I. And then go to the 3 and multiply it by each of the items in that quantity and get plus 3I minus 3. Pay attention to the signs when you're multiplying. So I squared is a negative 1, and negative I plus 3I is a positive 2I. Then you have minus 3. So negative 1 minus 3 is a negative 4, and you have plus 2I. Alright, so let's go back and remember this stuff. In a general form, A plus B, and then A minus B. That multiplies to give you A squared minus B squared. That's a difference of 2 squares. That comes from Algebra 1. So if I had x plus 2 and x minus 2, if the quantities are the same and the signs are different, then all you do is put a minus sign in the middle, square the first one, which is x squared, and then square the last one, which can be in either one of them. 2 squared is 4. So it would be x squared minus 4 when you multiply those two together. If I had, let's make it w minus 3, and then w plus 3. Minus in the middle, square the w, square the 3, and there's your answer, a difference of 2 squares. What if I had this? What if I had I plus 2 and I minus 2? What do I square first? I, and get what? I squared, and what sign goes in the middle? Minus, and what's 2 squared? 4. Now, it works the same with imaginary numbers, except that the reason we're doing them for imaginary numbers is so that we can eliminate the I. What is I squared? Negative 1, and then minus 4 would give me a minus 5 for the answer. So in the denominator, we get rid of the I by doing a difference of 2 squares and being left with just a number. That's how we avoid having an I in the denominator. Here's another one. What about I plus 5, I minus 5? What do I square first? And get I squared, what's the sign? And 5 squared? 25. And I squared is equal to negative 1. So negative 1 minus 25 is a negative 26. What if it were I plus 10 and I minus 10? I would have I squared minus 100. And the I squared is negative 1. So I end up with a negative 101 on the bottom. Or if it were a fraction, it would be on the bottom.